Hi, everybody. Welcome to another workshop series organized by the Global Speech and Debate Council, the Debate Central, Debating WhatsApp, and Horatio Podium. We are extremely glad to bring you the workshop on rebuttals and debating, and we are very sure our facilitator will give a lot of justice to the session, and all of you will get a lot to learn from this engaging session as well. Sam, as we all fondly refer to him, me and my couple of friends have known him for a very long time, has a lot of experience in debating across the world and also predominantly does a lot of competitions where he's also scored, been an IA and also been an SA and also been an avid speaker over the last couple of years. His wide range of experiences will definitely give a lot in terms of experience for you all, and we are very glad that he has agreed to do this session with us. Thank you, Sam. I'll hand over to you. You can start whenever you're comfortable to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kaushik. Nice, and thanks to everyone who joined in. Please, you can share the links with your friends if you also want them to join in and benefit from the session as well. I'm going to try and ensure that this session is as interactive as possible. Um, but just a few rules about how the session is going to go. I do appreciate if people, have questions. Please feel free to raise your hand or, type in the chat if you have a question. I'm very happy to pause and then we can discuss your question. Immediately you have them, please feel free. There'll be some Q&A at the end, but sometimes you might forget these questions if you don't ask them immediately. Secondly, as well, this session is meant to be an intermediate session. So that means that what we're going to be discussing today, if it's not going to be what is rebuttal, as I would teach my kids, uh, this means negating the other side. So I think that is basically something that everyone knows. Secondly, as well, it's not pretty much going to be a very, very advanced session because, like, if you're at the top level, then you presumably know how to do most of these things as well. So yeah, this is going to be, for literally for people who are transitioning or trying to work their way around, being better in debating as well. So it's not like you have, peaked at the top. We are going to cover, the various strategies around rebuttal, and as well, how you can improve in terms of rebuttal. Additionally, and also very, very importantly as well, is that one might ask, why do I need to learn how to rebut if I'm, speaking first or if I'm speaking member? Um, the answer to the first question, if you are speaking first, is, you need to learn how to rebut even though you're a first speaker because of what we refer to as preemptive rebuttal. Like even if it is the case that you don't rebut anything at all in your speech as L or PM, you need to learn how to rebut because obviously you need to do, preemptive rebuttal, and that is encouraged uh, most of the time. And one might ask as well, if I'm MG or MO, my priority is usually delivering the extension. The answer to your question as well is if you think about it, if PM and LO can do preemptive rebuttal, then you can also do the same as well. This means that, maybe I can't rebut my opening, but sure, the other side can, and your opening are rebutting themselves essentially when they try to do preemptive rebuttal. They're not directly rebutting themselves, but they are in some way trying to anticipate some response to themselves. So this means that, as MO and MG, not just at the start of your speech where you're like, some rebuttal to the previous speaker, but as well, the extensions that you make also can as well be derived from, the rebuttal that you intend to make as well, or the stuff that you anticipate that the other side is going to say to your team. So yes, this is why this session is useful, even though you are not going to speak as DPM or as upweight ever, even though that's highly unlikely. Anyways, so let's get right into it and let's start by, going to the various strategies around this. So on type of rebuttals, you might hear or come across people say that there are two types of rebuttal. I don't disagree with them. People say that there are, pure rebuttals, direct rebuttals. So someone says something that you disagree with it. So yeah, that's one. I will call it, a characteristic of a rebuttal, not essentially a type. And the other one is what some people might call, competing rebuttal. So what competing rebuttals do is that, we both want the same thing, but what we try to do is that we try to achieve the same thing in different ways. So yeah, those are like the two, characteristic of a rebuttal. So it's either trying to say, I disagree with you, or trying to say, I don't entirely disagree with you, but I think that the stuff that you want to do can be done using a different method. So yes, let's look at the type of rebuttals that we are actually going to be discussing in today's session beyond, competing and direct rebuttal. Two types as well. But what it fundamentally involves here is either trying to challenge the premise of an argument. So either trying to challenge, the underlying reasons or the underlying premises or the foundation that our argument relies on, or trying to challenge the conclusion of the argument. So in terms of challenging the premises, I'm not going to be doing a full, workshop on, either of these things, but I'm just going to try and tell you how to identify them. And as well, this becomes, multiple tools that you have. So I think that what people struggle with these days is that they do struggle with, how do I rebut? How do I respond to them? Someone is providing like 5 responses and you're wondering how they're doing it. Basically, what they're doing most of the time is all of this. So either trying to attack the framing or characterization or analysis that most people might refer to as mechanization. So all of these are premises that are embedded in each argument. So these are like the foundation of each argument, or trying to attack the conclusion. So the aesthetics of the argument, what it looks like, the impact, or specifically the value that certain people attribute to a particular impact as well. So all of these are conclusions, and the first 3 are the premises that arguments rely on. So we're going to look through each of these, and like I said earlier, this is valuable whether or not you are on OG and whether or not you're CG as well, and trying to look through your openings case. Obviously, you cannot directly say that what they have said is incorrect, but this is also a way that you try to think about how to go beyond what they have said as well, given that also that functions as some form of engagement, which is integrated in this session. So yes, let's look at the first one, challenging the premise. So we're going to talk about rebutting frames. So the simple word for rebutting a frame is what people usually refer to as trying to outframe a particular team. So trying to outframe a team. And usually what happens, and the way that this looks like, is that certain types of people make arguments, and that argument is tailored in a specific way or looking towards a specific thing implicitly. So an example is, I think that this was the WDC semis in 2023, the Madrid WDC semis, the one about this house regrets the dominance of the left in universities. So yeah, I think that to a large extent, there are a lot of arguments made in that round, either socially or politically or academically. And most of the time in those kind of debates, what you always find out is that a particular team is making an argument along the lines of, with the rise of the left in universities, people might distrust unis and not go. And that is the arguments are tailored specifically in that particular direction. And when you want to go beyond them, when you want to specifically outframe them, you want to sort of try and explain that the consideration in the round goes beyond academics. And this doesn't mean, just adding social impact, like saying this might mean people hate each other more, or this might mean that students don't collaborate with each other in the academic setting. To outframe successfully, you have to explain, why academia and the academic impact that I discussed in the round do not matter more. Like a common response that you always find is to say that, people wouldn't distrust academia because like a lot of people respect academia based on the fact that either you have someone who goes to school, in a family, or perhaps the fact that, to get a job, you need to go to school, etc. So I think that this is like the simple way, in which you're able to respond to a frame. Because the argument constructed along the lines of, if people don't go, if the left is dominant at universities, people from the right will hate universities, no longer send their kids there. All of these are impact, like people no longer go to school, etc. But all of them operate within the structure of academia, and people disliking academia, which is, this premise that argument relies on and the frame that our argument operates in. You cannot just come and be like, social impact, maybe you can say that, but the judges may still consider, academia and social impact to be equally valuable. And the way you sort of want to try and outframe a specific team in the debate is to explain that, people might not, the debate doesn't really affect academia, and the way people perceive academia is likely to be the same. With the example on the screen, I think that this was a motion I debated last year. So this house, as the Catholic Church, would oppose transhumanism, assuming it exists widely. I think I was all in this round, and a lot of the times, what gov teams in this debate might try to prove is, they might try to explain that this is valuable to the church theologically, or like invaluable to the church theologically, like if people, are using this sort of technology. So like this would be really terrible or bad for the church, like church doctrine specifically. And I think that most of the time, this argument operates within the realm that the church wants buying, wants to attract followers, wants to, be consistent to the people who opt into the religion, etc. All of these are like multiple claims that they're making, but all of these claims operate within the realm of the church as a church. And that's what you're able to identify. The opposite of this, and what you want to try and explain comparatively, is that, the Catholic Church is exists beyond, the doctrines of the church, and things like, politics is something that the church is actively, involved in or engaged in, or, wants to attract donations, etc. A simple argument that we made in that round, was to say that, if people could live very long, and that the church could ultimately do this sort of thing, then that means that, the church ultimately encourages people to do it. Then that means that the church is able to multiply its followers, that sort of thing as well. So that the church is able to multiply its followers and become more politically relevant. So like the shift towards the left that you maybe have, or people becoming more secular, if the church is successfully able to tell people to be, to opt into transhumanist technology, and then they are able to live longer, then that means that, the decline of conservative church population is going to diminish significantly. So what we tried to say here was go beyond, the frame that did operate being within the church, attracting more followers to becoming to extend to the point where the church is some sort of political actor and interested in politics, as well as affecting broader society, beyond just being able to attract people who care about spirituality, or being able to attract people who just donate to church stuff, because all of this relates to people wanting to go to heaven, or the church serving as some sort of spiritual bridge between man and God. Yeah. So the strategy here, or as well, requires you to identify what is the burden in the debate. So for example, I think that in this sort of debates, it will be maybe unreasonable to say that the church should oppose this, specifically because it would be unreasonable to say that the church should oppose this specifically because, when the church says it, people are not going to do it. It's very, very easy for someone to say, but yeah, people would do what they like. People want to live very long, etc. And that might mean that, the argument that you make, if a team just, goes full blown and says, when the church says people should oppose this, then they would oppose this, etc., then that means that you essentially missed your burden. Or you've essentially, the team has missed their burden when they do that, and you want to call this out, specifically, this is the way in which this is the frame in which their arguments are operating in. Their argument operates within the frame where religion says don't do this and people don't do it. Like maybe this can be true, but may not be true for something like this, like people being able to live forever. Especially if it is the case that the reason why people opt into religion is because they care about where their soul is going to go, when they die. Yeah. So secondly, as well, this involves rejecting false comparisons, and this is very, very important in rebuttal. Why? Sometimes when you have a this household motion, for example, I think I recently saw one. This house would I think maybe motions like votes of no confidence, etc. And you have a team, forcing you to compare between votes of no confidence and elections. But like, yeah, both are going to happen. The alternative of voting isn't mutually exclusive to um, people having a vote of no confidence. So you want to sort of reject false comparatives in debates, because sometimes some people might force you to compare between two things that are not necessarily mutually exclusive. This doesn't mean that you can't. Obviously, you can always make the argument as well that, if people, for example, um, did a vote of no confidence, that would affect the way elections work, and elections are more valuable than votes of no confidence. So you could always walk around the argument in this way. But sometimes people genuinely make the argument and like totally ignore that both of them exist on the same side. Like you can have a vote of no confidence and still have elections. So it might be a false comparative when the team is forcing you to defend one and isolate the other entirely. They have to prove why those stuff are mutually exclusive. So yeah, when is it unreasonable to refute? So I think that sometimes it might be unreasonable to avoid, rebutting, the framing that certain teams have provided. So, if a team has successfully identified the correct burden in a debate, they have successfully identified the correct comparative in the round, and when their arguments are operating within multiple frames, then it would be unstrategic for you to go through the framing route, like to just be unstrategic, because you would struggle. For example, a team has explained that this argument or that their case operates, within the developing world, and you're like, no, I don't think that it does. Like, this debate is like developed world. True, it might occur in those instances, but sometimes it's unreasonable to refute because when the debate happens on the other side, that's the majority of the debate. So maybe you might go that route and try to refute them in terms of framing and be like, I'm trying to expand the scope of this debate. But yeah, you could expand the scope, but not really change anything meaningfully in the debate if you have taken a huge chunk of it already. So yeah, sometimes the specific context that the debate operates in, like the developed world or the developing world, does constitute framing. Sometimes people might make their argument premised on the developing world, and you want to call this out. Sometimes it's unstrategic to do so, and you shouldn't be doing this as well. So when a team, usually when you want to outframe a team, it's usually when they are ignorant that their arguments are operating within a specific frame. When a team is aware that their arguments are operating within a specific frame, it means that usually that they have thought about the burden in the debate. It means that they have thought about what changes on either side and what's the specific comparative of the other side as well, and also means that they have provided reasons as well for why the debate occurs specifically in that frame. So you may want to refute them, but maybe it's unstrategic because if the judge has believed this, then you might be wasting your time, and time is the most valuable resource in debate. So yes, I think I'm going to move to the next one. But before I move on, does anyone have any questions so far? Any question? Okay, fair enough. Let's continue. The next one is, refuting or rebutting characterization. And sometimes I'm not just going to do the, discussion about the difference between framing and characterization, but I'm just going to use more like a specific civil engineering distinction. Some people might disagree, with me, but yeah, some people might say there's no distinction. But when we talk about framing and characterization, it's like, if you're building a house, the space in which the house, the structure of the building, are what we refer to as the frame. And what's inside is what we refer to as, characterization. The features of the house internally might be what you refer to as characterization. So in debating terms, if someone says the developed world and the developing world, they are referring to the context in which the debate operates in, which might constitute some form of framing. But when they describe what the developing world looks like, then they are characterizing. So when I say that the Catholic Church, cares about politics and social impact beyond, religion and scripture, then I am making, a description about I'm making, a specific description about the context rather in which the Catholic Church operates in, discusses as well. But if I'm talking about, what the composition or describing the Catholic Church in some way, then I am making, a characterization. I'm characterizing what the description of the Catholic Church looks like. The also another linguistic difference that you might point to as well might be to say that if you are trying to explain what people should care about, then you're framing. If you're trying to explain what people care about, or what people look like, then you're characterizing. So yeah, that's the sort of distinction before we move into it. And when we sort of refer to refuting characterization, what we mean, usually what people say is recharacterization. So that's what you're trying to do. This doesn't mean that you just come out of the blue and, you state what you like. This also means that you have to engage specifically with the characterization that people have provided. Um, what I've listed on the screen are various attempts for people to characterize. It's not limited to this. So yeah, the first thing here is incentive. And the way that you want to rebut incentives, and sometimes people make arguments along the lines of what someone cares about and what they're motivated by. That's essentially what incentives look like. And for example, some people might make an argument that, the Catholic Church cares about, followers, and, more people opting into the church and buying, etc. True, that might be one incentive, but think about it, I have a motivation to record, to participate in this, workshop. I also have a motivation as well to, watch a football game today. Both of them are not clashing with each other, maybe, but it affects, how I do everything else today. Like, the fact that I already, did my workout that I usually plan out for the evening because, I may have little time to do, the sort of exercise after the session as well. So yes, this means that, people have incentives that might not be competing with each other, but might affect the way that they behave in other ways as well. And this is the way that you want to think of the rebuttal. So this means someone points to a specific incentive and you point to another, and then you're able to explain why, the fact that those two incentives exist means that they don't behave specifically in the way that they describe. So like my incentive to record this session isn't going to mean that, all of my activity in today is going to be structured around, getting ready for the session, because of the fact that there are other things that I might want to do that may not be clashing. I might prioritize doing them at specific portions of the day. So yeah. Secondly, as well, sometimes people's incentives are competing with each other. And, this means that, if you want to buy, people care about getting, good grades in school. People also care about making friends. Both of these things are things that people are motivated by and maybe competing with each other, given that, you have maybe limited time to do both as well. So yeah, identifying that there are competing incentives as well, also affects, the way that you refute someone when they say that, if someone is motivated to, participate in school academically, this might mean that they read their book. Not necessarily the case if that particular person cares about going to play video games every evening. It might be the case that those two incentives are clashing. They don't have a lot of time to do both, and that means that they don't behave specifically in that way that they describe. Secondly, as well, I thought when it comes to incentives, that people assume that everyone is rational. So like people do 2 + 2 and all that, like philosophers, and then you do syllogisms, premise one, premise two, premise three before you make every decision. Nope, people are not rational. People are also motivated by, pretty terrible stuff, or maybe not entirely terrible, but also people are motivated by emotions. So people have ego, for example, that also affects them. People also are motivated by, greed. So people aren't always rational, and people are also always irrational as well. So it doesn't also applies on both sides. People might be rational, people might be irrational. So being able to identify that humans, or like entities that you're discussing in debates, do not have a uniform incentive and care about multiple things, helps you understand that affects the way that they behave with a third thing that they care about. It also might affect the way that they behave specifically in terms of what they prioritize and how they go about certain things. And thirdly, also might mean that they don't act rationally, as the other side, I presume. So this is the pathways to try and respond into teams. The second thing is capacity. What does this mean? Usually here, what we mean by capacity is what someone is able to do. And sometimes some people assume that, because capitalists have money, then this means that they are able to bypass regulations, especially because they care about making profits. So they have money to capture the state. True, this might be the way that you try to make the argument. But oftentimes they do miss the point that the motion also can affect the capacity of the actor. So this means that if the motion is, this house would significantly, regulate, big tech, um, the motion, to significantly regulate, big tech, you do need, maybe a more, political will, etc. And so the way that you explain this might overcome specifically the capacity that big tech has to lobby government. So when people say lobby, they're making a point that is prior to the debate. I'm not going to use the word a prior, but they're just making a point that it's outside of the debate. They're not making a point that specifically explains how the motion interacts with the capacity that the actor or the entity possesses as well. So they're just assuming that the capacity that the entity has is always going to overpower the motion, not explaining how the extent of the motion also can influence the actor. So usually it's a push and pull, and like it goes both ways. So sometimes people assume that the motion is able to overcome someone's capacity, and sometimes people assume that their capacity is always going to be able to overcome the motion. And this is something that you want to point out in rebuttal that isn't the case. And this is always the way that you want to think about rebuttal. The third thing is composition. And this is usually the most common mistakes that people make and the most common ways that people aren't thinking about rebuttal. What this means is that sometimes people assume that social movements are always, liberal, good guys. Usually they are, but yeah, social movements are made up of, people who are radical, people who are moderate, people who are, on the fringe, maybe people who are from centrist parties that are part of liberal movement, liberal social movement, as well. Additionally, when people make the argument, usually about developing countries, they sort of lopside all of them together. Like, India as a developing country is vastly different from Mozambique. So, yeah, the motion is not going to really affect them in the same way. So people are making the wrong description of developing countries when they just say, all of them are bad. India is a developing country, but like far more developed than a lot of other developing countries as well. Also, a country like Rwanda is not the same as Niger. So yeah, sometimes people just assume that entities are homogeneous in the way that they're composed. So when people make the argument about, maybe about not maybe specifically about country, but maybe about capitalism, for example, and big tech, some people might just assume that big tech, Facebook, and Meta or Meta, Mark, and some people might miss the point that there are shareholders and there are CEOs, management, and there are people who are upper management, lower management, etc. Sometimes when people make arguments about social policy, they assume that there's a top 1% and there's a bottom class or like people who are poor or people who are not in the top 1%, and they just assume that poor or like top 1% versus the rest of society. They just make their argument specifically in this way. But no, society isn't composed specifically in this way. Within social classes, you have the poor, middle class, the upper class. They do interact with each other in different ways. Also, there are distinctions also between each group, especially because of the fact that certain groups might be poor, but that intersects as well with the fact that some poor people might be white, some poor people might be Hispanic. So it's not to assume that the composition of a particular thing is the same throughout, because that might mean that you are able to respond to someone who is assuming that they are homogeneous or behave in the same way as well. So some people always assume that churches are always, how do you say, they're always bad because of the fact that they're always regressive because of the fact that they are made up of people who are conservative. But this is not always the case as well. There are liberals as well within religion, and this might also be some insignificant, not very significant relative to conservative people, but it also constitutes a very good portion of people within the church that you can also recharacterize the debate in a way that includes them. The final thing is position and proximity. And I'm just going to try and explain this with, the motion below. So this house has a competent politician in a failing democracy would try to win elections by any means necessary. So this was a motion I debated some time ago. If you check the tab, I replaced that round, but it doesn't really matter. Sometimes it doesn't always work, anyways. But yeah, what we try and did in that particular round, and this might be why I wanted to talk about preemptive rebuttal early on. Well, what we try and say in that debate was to say that for a competent politician, what does it mean to win elections by any means necessary? What is proximate when you think about winning elections by any means necessary? Does it mean that a competent politician in a failing democracy is going to take up arms and against the states and going to stage a rebellion? Obviously, we made the even if argument. So like even if they were going to do this, which is important for you to make, but implicitly, what we said and what we anticipated was that the other side was going to try and compel and force you to defend, um, violence. And usually it's not always strong. It's not very intuitive. You might not win against the violence case. So you want to sort of give the judge an idea that, a competent politician in a failing democracy, what's proximate to them, when, they think about it, I'm going to win this election by any means necessary, might be to rile up their base, to, talk about this, politician, in a different way, a competent politician might, do positive campaigning. Now they try and do, negative campaigning, smear campaigns, etc. Hiring foreign corporations that might be distrusted within their region as well. Coming out to say the elections are bad and a mess. That we shouldn't trust the political system, etc. They might not say that we do an insurrection like Donald Trump and January 20. So yeah, that's what we try to say, that this is what is proximate to a competent politician, and things like telling people to go out on the street and be violent might not be proximate to them, either because of the fact that of their nature, which we characterize in the debate, but as well the fact that they don't have the capacity to engage in such things, so this is not going to be proximate to them. Also as well, position also affects the way that you're able to refute certain teams in the debate. So, for example, the position of a country might affect the way that you try to characterize against certain things that the other side is saying. So some people might always assume that the UK leaving the EU, for example, and Brexit, is going to be the end of ties between the UK and the EU. But if you do check, I think one of the most discussed things now within the UK is that it's not really so much of a difference. There's some difference economically, but there's still a lot of integration between the EU and the UK, and that's vastly because the proximity, that they share, either because of the fact that it's not very far, from the UK to France, which is like, a very, big and important stakeholder within the EU. So yeah, position also affects, the way that people make arguments in debate. So this means that sometimes people might assume that the motion implicitly means that, or everything is going to crap. So like this house support Brexit, and someone might just assume that, that means entirely that both economies decouple. Politically, they might decouple to some extent, but the way that you try and mitigate this in a debate is say that, based on the position, it's going to be difficult for you to have, an entire decoupling, which might mean that their impact are unlikely to happen. So this might allow you to describe where decoupling is useful and allow you to, explain and recharacterize against where decoupling isn't going to happen and mitigate against those sort of impact. Yeah. So as well, the stuff about a competent politician in a failing democracy, the capacity of a competent politician, as I discussed, is important to characterize, what a failing democracy looks like in terms of the composition of a failing democracy. Also, I think that you might be able to characterize for and against, and implicitly when you are trying to build this within your own speech as well, what you want to try and do is to think of what the other side is going to miss out on. So what incentives are they going to miss out on that this entity cares about? What are they going to miss out on in terms of what the capacity that this actor possesses and how the debate changes or interacts with that particular capacity? What composition of this actor are they going to miss? Are they going to assume that Israel is homogeneous? And are they going to assume that, Israel is just made up of, Jews, the Arabs as well in Israel? not a lot of people know this. Some people assume that Israel is made up of Jews and Christians. Um, I'm not entirely sure that this is the case. There's like a huge chunk of Arabs as well in Israel. There's a good chunk, rather, of Arabs as well in Israel. Within also the Jewish population, there are, Haredim Jews, that's Orthodox Jews as well. There are, more liberal Jews. So like composition, what composition of the debate are they going to miss out on, or composition of the entity are they going to miss out on? Are they just going to assume that, Facebook is just Mark Zuckerberg and, maybe the shareholders who invest there? Are they going to really discuss, the poor and, the upper, the management, as well as, the people who work there internally within those management systems? Are they going to, assume that society is just made up of the 1% and everyone else? Or are they going to really discuss in detail, the poor and the middle class? Are they going to assume that, tensions between populations exist only as well between, minorities and majorities? So, for example, maybe in China, it might be the case that people might just say, Han Chinese and, maybe immigrants. There are also distinction as well between, people who are Chinese citizens as well. And this might be something that's important to consider, as well as the fact that people might, assume that developing countries are all the same, India and, Mozambique or Madagascar the same, if it is in fact that they are different. Or even within Africa, people might assume that, Rwanda is same as Niger, which is vastly, wrong. And this is something that you can oftentimes anticipate and characterize against. So yeah, that is all about, recharacterizing, which is a form of rebuttal. I'm going to move on to the next one. Before then, does anyone have, any question about this, or what I said so far? Okay, so I'm just going to move on. The next thing is mechanisms, refuting mechanisms. So the problem here is that sometimes people might say, why is this different from, characterizing? So characterizing is like giving a description, X is a boy, or X is a girl, or X is a non-binary person. That's just the description, X likes to eat, bananas. These are just description, like they're statement of fact. But what we refer to by mechanisms is, the pathway towards, a specific behavior. And there are like four things that are listed here. Also might be more than four. Missing burdens of proof, duplicate mechanisms, wrong mechanisms, and, mutually exclusive mechanisms. What do we mean by missing burdens of proof? Every argument that a team is going to make requires them to prove certain things, So, for example, the motion on the screen, this house would ban for-profit hospitals. A team wants to make the argument that banning for-profit hospitals will make, um, hospital services or healthcare services accessible for a lot of people or cheap. This is the argument that they want to make. But you really cannot just say this and, someone is going to believe this. There are a series of steps that you have to explain in order for people to believe this argument in the first place. For example, with this house would ban for-profit hospitals and, trying to prove that there is going to be reduced healthcare costs and it's going to be cheaper. The first thing that you have to do is explain, why do for-profit hospitals charge, exorbitant costs? And secondly, why is it going to be difficult for you to regulate them? Given that, regulate the costs that they set, given that now you have to ban them. If it is the case that things like price control systems exist, if it is the case that competition exists, why are those mechanisms insufficient? So these are the first two steps. The first one, why do they charge high? Why are they unwilling to change? Those are the first two steps that you have to prove in this argument. If you prove one and you don't prove two, then you are going to be really vulnerable to a response. And sometimes when a team is improving, prove one, doesn't prove two, then usually it's very, very easy to attack them by saying that competition is going to account for this. The next thing then is to prove why banning them, and the new owners that they're going to have. Usually in this case, it's always the case that when you ban for-profit hospitals, then you nationalize them. So why is it the case that government is going to care? Why is it the case that government is going to make, hospital services more accessible and cheaper? Usually this one is rather straightforward if you say it, but when you think about this is a lot more difficult than just saying that, government cares a lot about its population. But why does it care? And that's what a lot of people would miss and not explain. Why do government care about, keeping prices low? Sorry, I see a question in the chat. Okay. Okay. Someone says they don't get the part about composition. Sorry. I'll go very, very soon. Anyways, so yeah, in terms of that burden of proof, what some people might miss here is that they might just miss, why is it the case that government is going to really care about its population? If it is the case that if government is running the hospital, then it still presumably has to, maybe raise taxes, etc., in a specific way. Or perhaps as well, the government still has to cater for a lot of costs, so maybe hospital services are still the same. So you have to deal with why government is going to, keep prices low and make it cheap, as well. So those are all the steps that you have to prove. One, you have to explain why the current management is, it's not going to make things cheap. So why you have to take it from them. So why there are no mechanisms to prevent them from, keeping prices low. And finally, as well, why, the people who you give it to now will care about keeping prices low. All of these have to be explained in depth. And usually when a team is making this argument, sometimes if you aren't listening, you wouldn't realize that they have missed one or two steps in making this argument. Another example of this might be, if a team, if in the debate about, this house as the Catholic Church would oppose transhumanism. So one argument that we made on up in that debate was to say that, the church can convince people to do this technology. Like the church is going to be able to convince people to opt in without backlash. That's sort of if you want to refute the backlash argument. What we tried to do here was to explain that, the other side, what they missed essentially was they did not fully explain why the church cannot coerce its followers, why the church cannot use doctrine to always tell people, to opt into a technology. Because what they said essentially was that, the church can't support transhumanism because the church has to oppose it in order for, you not to get backlash. But the missing burden in that argument is like, why is the church going to be unsuccessful at telling people to do stuff? That's the missing burden. Like, true, maybe people may think that, COVID vaccines are terrible, but and if the church tries to tell them that COVID vaccines are good, they might, maybe be skeptical. But why is the church ever going to be unsuccessful at telling people this sort of stuff? I think that the intuition that most people might rely on is, why we tell people about, minority rights within church, some people might be hesitant. So what we did in that round was to identify that they hadn't proved that specifically with transhumanism, the church was going to be unpersuasive at telling people to do this stuff. Simply what we said here was that, God's plan for man was always to live forever. And, that was like typified in the story of the Garden of Eden when, man ate the forbidden fruit and was told to leave. So the church could always frame this as, God's gift to mankind, especially because of the fact that, this was the original plan that is, depicted in the Christian Bible. Sorry if you're not familiar with, this stuff. But yeah, also another missing burden in that explanation is why would the church really do this? Like maybe there is a way I can, try and convince you that, eating once a day is good for your health. But why would I really want to do that? Like, why would I really want you to hurt yourself? So what we said here was that politically this was useful for the church because, like, if the church opposed transhumanist technology, then the church was going to be at odds with like a huge chunk of society, and that's going to be a problem. So that's why the church has some incentive to do this. So all of these are like burdens that are required of you to prove in order for the arguments to work. So sometimes don't allow people to get away with like intuition. Like sometimes people are just rely on a broad intuition that is never really in the debate. With every motion, with every argument that you try to make, rather, there is a specific path that you have to prove. There's a specific burden that you have to identify that is required for that argument in order for it to work. why would people behave in this way? Why would people respond to this sort of thing in this particular way that is described? The final example I'm just going to discuss with this is, the one about this house as this house believes that the regrets the dominance of the left in universities. And popular argument that people would make is um polarization, that the left in universities is going to mean people are angry, the right is going to be pissed off, and that's going to be polarizing. But a missing burden that you would identify if you think about this argument is, uh, why is polarization going to change? Like, why is this going to affect polarization if it already exists? So what you want to prove here is why this, increases the amount of polarization that already exists. Why this is going to be a unique reason, why polarization is going to occur in society. And you're not just proving this by saying this, like saying this isn't proof, like saying that, this is going to be an extra reason isn't proof, but explain that this is something that people are going to think about, this is going to affect them. If people are going to react to this, people are going to see this. So all of this are like different ways that you try and explain an argument, maybe through the senses, people see this, people respond to this. So it requires you to prove that they see it in the first place, because if you don't prove that they see it and you just try to explain that they respond to it, then, the argument might be unsuccessful. I was seeing a debate this afternoon about, a literary canon, and, it's just like standardizing literary works. And this was like a round two motion of HWS. And what people were trying to debate in that room was to say that, if you have a literary canon, then, average individuals in society are going to be able to understand what books are good and what books are bad. And, a missing burden in that argument that I think that someone pointed out, even though the response, I don't think it was, the most successful, was to say that, why would people, interact with the literary canon in the first place? Like, for example, you can have standards in science, but like the average individual on the street isn't a scientist. So like maybe, you might know that, keeping an acid, in a specific place in your house might be bad for you, or, you might just know the basic stuff, but you might not interact with science, specifically on the rules or the ethics of science, just as well as you might not interact with literature. You might not decide to read a book and go to Google and check, what the standards, in the literary canons are. So it requires you to explain, why would people, interact? Why would people see the canon? Why would people respond to the canon? And what those responses and actions are going to look like as well. So those are missing, burdens that oftentimes teams may not provide. But then you can always be able to spot this if you think about the argument that it just relies on intuition and they're not really connecting the logical dots. This is where you need to find premise one, premise two, premise three, premise four. Sometimes there are missing premises, and then you need to talk about this. Yeah, so I'm just going to go back quickly and talk about the composition thing. So what I mean by composition, missing composition is, I'm just going to go back here. Yeah, when we're talking about characterization, it's to say that what is an entity composed of? That's essentially what it means. So developing countries, yes, what are they composed of? They're composed of countries who are, terrible, not very good. They're developing, but not developing as fast as certain countries. So the rate of development in India is vastly greater than the rate of development, in Niger or Chad or Nigeria, even, for example. So this sometimes people might make arguments about the developing world and compose, like, make everyone in the developing world look the same. Another example is like, when we discuss social movements, people assume that social movements are always, liberal, in a specific way. So sometimes social movements are not homogeneous. So you oftentimes have, allies who are not members of the movement. They're not, they do not identify with that particular group. Sometimes you have people who are, radical as well within the group. Like they are part of the group, but they are, very, very extreme, in the sort of ideologies that they support, etc. You also have people who are, on the fringe, people who, think that the idea is great, but, do not really vibe with it as much. So yeah, these are like what you might mean, in terms of a composition, for example, as well, the fact that not everyone in India is Hindu. So sometimes people might just assume or presume here, make arguments along the line of, people are voting in this specific way and just miss out on the fact that, the actor is composed of a lot more than, that specific description that they have provided. And that might mean that you're just able to mitigate the arguments that they're making by explaining that, not the composition that they have described or they have provided is just a fraction of what actually exists. So, for example, society, like top 1% and the rest of society, usually there's more, like, the middle class, which makes up, even a larger chunk of society as well, and react in different ways as opposed to the poor, either because of the fact that they have more education than the poor, less wealth than the rich. So that's like basic description of what it looks like. But the composition here is that the society isn't just made up of, poor and top 1%. Does that answer your question, Toby?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Next thing is duplicate mechanisms. And this is like what you shouldn't be rebutting. Like, usually sometimes people make, the same argument over and over again. Like mechanize the same argument over and over again. And like everything that you're looking at is just one assumption. So like companies, exploit workers by, taking their salaries, giving them long working hours, not paying them as much. Also, they might use substandard products in substandard resources in making their products. They might hike prices, etc. Like usually, this is like duplicate mechanisms. So like the team is like providing 5 reasons why monopolies hurt society. They exploit workers. They jack up prices. They use substandard products. They buy off other smaller companies, etc. Usually it's the same thing. Like what they're trying to say is that large companies care about making profits. Like you just be wasting your time, like if you try and refute each of those things. Because like the judge would most likely believe one or two. So like what you just want to think about here is that what they're doing is that they're repeating the same mechanism like different ways. Like they're not really changing anything. That they're saying 4 structural reasons, but like those 4 structural reasons, like usually the team would like give you like 4 structural reasons, and everything that they have said is basically echoing the same thing that companies care about making profit. Or like right wing individuals like radical in their views, etc. So like you can't go the route of trying to rebut them, in rebut those mechanisms individually or trying to mitigate some of those. But usually it isn't the right strategy. And the way you should be thinking about the response is what are they trying to say? Like they might not say it obviously, like they might just say that, these are the reasons why monopolies are bad, and they just give you those 4 reasons, and you're thinking about how am I going to respond to all of these 4 things. But when you think of the summary here, what you're simply trying to say is that companies care about making profit, and this is the only thing that you maybe need to take down. This is the premise that you just need to deal with. Either how companies can make profit in a different way that doesn't require them to do all of the bad stuff that they say that they're going to do, or why companies don't really want to do those bad stuff because maybe there are consequences associated with doing those things as well. So yeah, this is like what I mean by duplicate mechanisms. So they're making like giving different reasons, but like what they're just giving us like, do I think of them as like examples or instances where an actor is going to behave or an entity is going to behave in a specific way, and that's just a duplicate mechanism. So that's something that you want to watch out for. So there's like no redundancy that they're building into their case. Like it just relies on a specific portion of how an actor is going to behave, which is something that you can easily take down without actually having to go through the individual, instances that they're given about when it occurs. Yeah. Also, this is important because, like I said earlier, maybe the judge would believe 1 or 2 of these mechanisms, and it might be unstrategic if you like in your second speech, you're like, I'm going to respond to, one, they said companies are going to, fire workers. This is why they don't. They said they're going to buy off companies. This is why they don't. Yeah, you might do this, but like maybe at the end of the day, the judge only believes 3. Maybe the judge even never believes the argument and believes something else. But you have less time. One, you lose out on time. Secondly, you may not be very convincing. I mean that the judge believes 1 or 2 of those mech, and you still lose. or even if you are successful, yeah, maybe you are successful, but you have paid a very high price. The way to sound very, very cool is if you are able to identify that this is what they mean. Like this is everything that they are trying to prove that, companies want to cut costs, want to make as much profit as possible. So the simple way that you can go about that response is explain why they do this in another way, or why there are other incentives that they have, which mean that they don't do the stuff. The other thing is wrong mechanisms. Like this is straightforward, something that is false that a team is trying to explain is true. So, for example, trying to explain that, churches are abusive, this is something that you can respond to upfront and say that, this is untrue. Like churches have no incentive to be, repressive or abuse their followers, specifically because of the fact that, it is the case that if they do so, that their followers leave, etc. So like this is false. Like the instances where they're describing are not instances of church doing this, but instances of individuals, who the church, punishes from time to time. So like this is just negation, like the pure rebuttal stuff. Like the mechanism is false. It's not true. Don't believe this. So this is something that you should always think of, are they attributing something to the correct thing? Like, are they attributing an impact to the correct behavior? Usually, some teams aren't. Like, they're just attributing the correct behavior to the correct impact to the wrong actor. Like, so they rely on someone else behaving in that way. So, um, which isn't true, and you just have to call this out that this is wrong and this is false. Yeah. The final thing is mutually inexclusive mechanism. This sort of is similar to duplicate mech, also kind of similar to false comparatives. But what I mean here is like, a team is pointing out something that doesn't change in the debates. Like, for example, a team is saying that the reason why you should break up large corporations is because they care about, that they're just going to max out on profit by, harming the rest of society. But true, why does this change if you like break them up? Like, does this mean that smaller corporations wouldn't really care about making profit? So this also might be, intuitively, they compete against each other, but true, that competition isn't always good. If there's the case that people are still trying to do the same stuff, in a different way, that means that they are competing with each other. People might compete to the bottom. So this is like a way to rebut them because maybe the impact that they're arguing for isn't mutually exclusive. Sometimes people assume that the conclusion of the argument makes sense. And that might be me diving, into conclusion, which is next. But yeah, usually the mechanisms are inexclusive. Another example is like, I was in this debate, it was a final, I guess. And the team goes on to like list like 9 mech for why I'm trying to remember the motion, but I think it was along the line. It was a political motion, and the team is like going to give me 9 reasons why youths care about voting, or are going to interact specifically with the motion, and they give like 9 reasons why. And when I think about this, yeah, true, 9 reasons why youths are going to care about politics on their side, which is why they don't need us. But those 9 reasons aren't mutually exclusive. Like you two still have those reasons anyways. Like what's really changing? Like it's just a plus or a side that you'd have those 9 reasons and we're doing this stuff. So yeah, sometimes people are just giving like I'm trying to remember the motion in that final. It might maybe give me a very clear picture of what I'm trying to visualize here. But what it means as well is that sometimes you don't have to go through the route of rebutting everything being a team has provided or every mech that you have provided because those mech are not mutually exclusive, wouldn't harm your case either ways. Like sometimes the team is just trying to prove that, politicians are bad actors, true, but they're bad actors on your side as well. What's really changing? Like what are you trying to prove? So also try to check and gut check what a team is providing to you as well. Does this change anything in the debate, or are they just repeating, incentives that are unlikely to be affected by the motion on either side? So yes, that is all about refuting mechanisms. If you do have any questions or stuff that I need to clarify, please let me know. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the next part, which is challenging the conclusion of the argument. this is also straightforward as well. What we mean by challenging the conclusion is, the premise is the, put part or the part for the conclusion or the foundation of the conclusion as well. The conclusion stands on the premise. So maybe a team is very good, the team is good, they operate in the correct frame, they have provided the correct characterization, they have provided, the, very good mechanisms that are, straightforward, multiple, not duplicates, inexclusive, or sorry, exclusive mechanisms. They have done a very good job, in building up a very good premise. It would be unstrategic to respond to the premise then, and it might be more strategic for you to challenge the conclusion, or maybe a team doesn't do the premise well, but the conclusion is easy to take down, and how do you do this? So the first thing then is, how do we refute impact? And yeah, this is the first stuff. Is the conclusion bad? Like, is it bad or good? Some people might just assume that competition is good, but really, is competition good? And this is something that you always have to check, with yourself. You know, they might just assume that competition is good and leads to good outcomes. Like, this doesn't mean that, because the team sets when companies compete with each other, that leads to more innovation in society, and that leads to, people being employed. True, might be true, but like, there is a bridge that is in between that competition and those good impacts. There's also a bridge between those impacts, like innovation that occur specifically being good. So what you can always refute there is why competition that they have provided as a conclusion doesn't lead to people being employed. Like, companies can compete with themselves in other ways that doesn't require them to employ more people as well. So yeah, this is the first thing that you have to be thinking of. Like, conclusion, they have reached the conclusion, but is that conclusion really desirable? Like, do we really want that in society as well? Secondly, as well, under whether or not the conclusion is good, is, you know, is innovation, something that people need? Like, is it something that people need? Or is the innovation that occurs specifically with the motion, going to be good innovation? Like, people could innovate in a negative direction as well that could hurt the rest of society. Just the way that we consider AI development to be bad in some ways, that it might take human jobs, or, it might be unethical in as much as AI might consider, human developments, to human existence to be bad, or the fact that you have ChatGPT and you have competition in the form of Twitter's Grok AI isn't a good competition. It's like that competition might be negative if Grok AI says certain things that are bad as well. So competition isn't always good. Innovation isn't always good, and you shouldn't always think about oh my God, they have proven this. Like, okay, how do I refute this? Like, maybe it isn't good, and that's just the way that you might try to refute this. Also, as well, applies in a converse way. Is the conclusion really bad? So they have proven that maybe this might need monopolies, but maybe monopolies might be necessary in certain sectors. Monopoly isn't always bad. Yeah, they might prove that you elect someone who is on the far right. True, but like electing someone on the far right doesn't always lead to bad outcomes. Some people might disagree with me, but this depends on the debate. It doesn't depend on your intuition about how someone from the far right is always going to behave. Depends on who is this person that you're electing from the far right. So just as people in Romania think that electing someone from the right is good for them, and also might be good for them as well. So someone just saying, what, the rise of far right leaders is bad, may not be bad, may be bad for Romanians, but the fact that we elected Donald Trump in the US isn't bad, overall entirely. Might be bad, because of the fact that there are terrible trade wars going on, short-term impact, but has shaped, the elections in Australia and Canada as well, as much as you have, right? Like, left-wing leaders, people are responding to this by electing, more left-wing leaders in those countries to protect them from, Donald Trump's trade war with those countries, or his invasive statements to overthrow them. So maybe you might elect someone from the far right, but yeah, someone might go ahead and list a lot of terrible things that would happen if Trump was elected, and you can explain good outcomes that can happen in places that matter the most. in places like, Canada and Australia, where you have maybe more left-wing leaders that, might be necessary or important in those specific places or contexts as well. So the conclusion isn't always bad. And the conclusion is just bad because people just have a strong intuition that, the right wing is bad. And I think that generally the debating meta might force people to prioritize, liberal left wing, impact more. But, just as the rule states, because someone says that, uh, talks about the right wing doesn't mean that you're losing as well. But intuitively, this means that as well that you can also explain why, negative stuff can lead to positive outcomes. So yeah. Secondly, is it that bad? This is straightforward. This means that, bad, I agree, but is it that bad? On scale, how many people are being killed? Killing is wrong, but if a team tells you that 200,000 people are dying, and in truth it's just 50,000, you want to mitigate this. This doesn't mean that you would win the debates, but this just means that you have taken 75% of your impact from them. So is it that bad? Nope. The impact accrue in the short term. So maybe in the long term, Trump will reform his policies, etc. You want to prove this. So it's not that bad. Maybe the stock market was terrible for a while, but conditions are improving, with the fact that China and the US are now willing to engage in negotiations. The comparative would have been, the even if we had someone who was on the left in power, you wouldn't have had that tipping point, where the US and China had to negotiate. You just have had, trade war that was, silently ongoing under Biden, where you had, restrictions on, semiconductor, tariffs that, Trump was, sorry, Biden was placing on China as well, etc. So chips, tariffs that Biden was placing on China. So you still have those things happening. Might just see, you just needed this tipping point, for trade relations between China and the US to improve. That might be best for everyone. So the impact might be bad, but just short term. And the impact isn't so bad because not a lot of people are suffering this impact. The impact isn't so bad. Yeah, maybe the rich might, suffer from significantly taxing them, but they have the financial resources to weather this impact as well. The impact isn't so bad because people are able to rationalize it. So like, I think that I was in this particular debate where I was trying to explain that, the rational capacity of the actor is, going to mean that they don't think of something as a harm. So maybe they experience harm, people might experience harm, but they don't think of it, as something that is actually harmful. They might just think of it as character development, as well. So it's bad, but it isn't that bad. And you want to just weaken the persuasiveness of that impact by proving that it doesn't happen for as long to the same extent. Other people don't think about it in that particular way that they think of it as harmful, or there's something else that we should care about, which is the next part, which is this the conclusion exclusive. So yeah, maybe some team might try to prove that competition is good, but you want to prove that you get more competition. If you think that competition is a valuable impact in the debate, there's just not one way to achieving it. There are other ways to get competition, and this is something that we want to try to explain. So that is the competing rebuttal. What is the general rule here? With competing rebuttal, what you want to try and prove when you want to try and do this is like you don't want to listen to whip. So this is like rebuttal that is disallowed for whip. And this is why I said that maybe the rebuttal session might just be as valuable to like the first week as even though like as the whip is something that is a skill at your disposal. But like yeah, within the deputies and whips, you really cannot provide a competing rebuttal, which is like you cannot try and explain how to achieve a policy or how to achieve an impact in a different way as some form of refutation. Judges aren't supposed to credit this. Some judges might, but they aren't supposed to, which might mean that, maybe you might do this and it's not very effective. So this means that the position of your competing rebuttal should always be, at the top of your first speech in any position that you find yourself in. So some conclusion you might consider good, but you'll try and explain how you get to that particular conclusion in a different way. So like I said, refuting impact is usually something that you try and do in economics motion, like or IR motion. With the sort of examples I'm trying to provide, I sort of maybe think that people might get the vibe. So like with economics and IR motion, the sort of knowledge that you might have is limited. And if you really try and go the route of trying to refute people's premises, especially when those premises aren't obvious, they rely on spec knowledge, you might, struggle with actually trying to refute the premises that they have provided, unless you actually have that knowledge. If you don't have the knowledge, you might want to go the route of refuting their conclusion, either by trying to explain that it isn't bad, that is the conclusion, but yeah, it isn't bad. It isn't a bad thing. And this is easy to do and persuasive as well, because if it's an economist and IR motion, chances are that the judges, and don't have that much spec knowledge. So it's easy for you to, go the route of trying to explain why their conclusion isn't actually a bad conclusion as well, or it isn't exclusive, or it isn't that bad. As well, I think that sometimes people don't conclude their arguments, and this is something that you have to be aware of. Like, there's no conclusion. Like, there's no conclusion. They just explain that people behave in this way, but there's no conclusion. And what I mean by conclusion here isn't just saying that, a harm will occur, but debate is always about comparative. Why is the harm that is going to occur greater than the benefit? That's what debates are about. And an example here was, I think that this was the quarters of PAUDC. So we had the motion about this house would I think it was a patent motion, like, patenting things like that belong to certain, cultures, like, Hakuna Matata, for example, or so like, yeah, this house regrets, the patenting of those stuff, but like patenting of Hakuna Matata or Mexican wine, etc. So usually we're CEO, and generally, optimists in the debates are going to be like, yeah, people shouldn't patent the stuff, because like if you patent it, then people are just going to use it. Like, the patent is going to go into the hands of white corporations like Disney, etc. Yeah, we agree with CG. CG was the team that tried to explain that, we shouldn't allow patents. We should allow everyone to access this. You know, it this was the route to the extension. But like, what we thought about here was that, like, really, like, is this an actual conclusion? Like, we want everyone to access this? Like, if you think about it, the fact that Disney says, that Disney trademarks Hakuna Matata isn't, doesn't mean that I can't say it. Like, I said it like 4 times here. So like, what do you mean by, what do you mean by access? Like, so access. But what do you mean? What does it mean? It's like, it isn't really a conclusion to just say, we want everyone to access this. Because like, what do you mean by access? Like, does Disney, trademarking it means I can't say it? Like, so what is the conclusion here? What's the actual harm? Like, so we did try and go a step further and say, maybe the actual harm is that, um, Disney is presumably, one of the people that gets to use this, but some companies don't get to use this as well. But what we said here was that, that's not a harm, because like, their comparative is missing why Disney still will not be able to use it. And you say to the extent where, it means that that company doesn't get as much benefit from using it as well. Even that, there are other, symmetry of power that, Disney it still has over these companies as well. So like, maybe you want some other people to access this, but why can't they access this as well? If it is the case that Disney prevents them from accessing it via patent, why can't they do it in other ways? So yeah, they made a very good case about access, but they just didn't have a conclusion, because like, it wasn't really clear who they wanted to access it on the comparative, and why they could access it as well. So yes, this is something that you have to watch out for. Like, some things have no conclusion, so you just don't want to be beaten thin air. You want to clarify this as much as possible to the judge. So yeah, we sort of tried to do this, by the time the Gulf Week was concluded, by saying, what, like, we listened to 2 speeches in CG, and like, yeah, they had a point, but that point didn't have a conclusion. So like, maybe you thought about the point, but like, the way you thought about the point was, if you flip the comparative, but CG isn't really proving anything, so they're losing the debate. Yeah. The next one is refuting weighing metrics. So I think that this presumably is tough, as well as the fact that it's integrated into everything that we have been saying so far. So what is the way to go about this? The first way is to challenge the validity of the metric that has been provided. So what is weighing? Essentially, maybe I have to talk about this quickly. So weighing is simply, a team trying to explain how you should value their conclusion, how you should value their impact. So, for example, I have proven that, people are going to suffer, and I said, like, these people who are going to suffer are the poor, who have no chance, no ability for them to be able to, cushion the suffering. If the government, jacks up taxes, the rich can, have other ways to go about this. They can diversify their portfolios, by buying art, or using tax havens. They have more money, so it means that even if the government does progressive taxation, it really doesn't affect them. But the poor have, no means that, raising up taxes is just going to affect their ability for them to be able to buy stuff. Uh, you know, like groceries, etc. This might be proximate to them. They might feel this more. So yeah, this is the metric I'm providing, that the intensity of that harm is felt more by the poor. So what you want to do is challenge the validity of that particular metric, and that's what you want to try and do with the rebuttal. Yep. So you want to try and explain that this metric that they have provided isn't actually valid. For example, maybe what I said is incorrect. That's what you're trying to say, that the intensity that I described for the poor isn't, the correct metric. The rich might feel this more intensity, especially given that the poor have access to social systems as well. So that means that they might not feel taxation. What government does is progressive taxation usually. So it might fall as a consequence more on the rich because there's more scrutiny on them, etc. And the fact that this sort of progressive taxation on them might affect, their ability to invest. That means that the rich feels it more, and the impact might stem from them. This is why you shouldn't, do it. This is like weighing metric, two different ones, on where the intensity that I've discussed actually falls on. So yeah, what you want to try and do as well is challenge the validity of the metric that your team is provided. Maybe you don't want intensity to be the metric. Maybe you want something else, to be the metric. But you have to do this by first challenging the initial metric that is being provided. Like I said, this is usually the weakest method because, like, if a team has gotten to the point where they explain that, this impact occurs more for the poor and the poor feel this more intensely, it's kind of going to be very hard for you to sort of disprove this, metric that they have provided. So usually you can challenge the validity of a metric if a team hasn't provided, reasons, for why we should value, the metric. So like we should weigh this argument heavily because it affects the poor. Why? The metric is that the poor feel this more intensely. That's the metric. If they are provided this with reasons, then you should avoid challenging this, and maybe you can provide a competing metric. So what do competing metric looks like? Firstly, what we mean by this is likelihood comparison. So both sides have provided different impact. You want to explain that your impact is more likely than theirs. So you guys provided reasons why your impacts are going to happen, but you want to explain why your impacts are much more likely to happen than theirs. Maybe it might mean that theirs take more steps. So that means that, takes more steps, then people are more hesitant to do this. So that yours might be the least path of resistance that people are going to follow. So this is like, one way to try and prove that your case is more likely than theirs. So people follow the least path of resistance. So maybe it's true that, their case would work, but people are much more likely to act in the way that you have described, given that, people follow the least path of resistance. Secondly, as well, as an example, it might be reversibility versus control, your ability to control this. That's also, to say that some people might provide an impact and say, we should prioritize this, because we can control, the way that this impact is going to happen. Governments have other ways in which they can control how people respond to rising interest rates. You can explain that the impact here are irreversible. So when that harm happens, then that means that, you're not going to be able to reverse this. It might be the case to say that before those extra mech that government has kick in, people are already dissatisfied and people already pull their money out of the system. That might trigger a crisis. The government is not going to be able to control or isn't reversible. So before those ways in which you are able to control this increase kick in, then you have a crisis that is irreversible already. And finally, also, like I said, intensity can be compared with scope. So maybe they do explain that a small section of the population feel this impact more intensely. You can explain that it affects, a larger proportion of people. So like this might, a simple, analogy here is the putting a speck of dust in people's eye versus, placing one person in the world and suffering for all eternity. So yeah. So one person will feel suffering intensely versus, everyone in the world having a speck of dust in their eye. So this is, the simple way to visualize what I mean by scope versus intensity. So yeah, I think that my time to take some questions, yeah, is now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask before I move on. Any questions so far?
I think they're very intently listening to, and you're explaining it so well they don't have any questions for you, Sam.
Yeah. So yeah, Kaushik also sent you like a sort of message. So yeah, I'm gonna like turn off my screen, but I'm just gonna move on to the next thing. Turn off my how do you say uh camera. Okay, so the next thing is preemptive rebuttal. So like I said, um, people would ask you and tell you like, oh yeah, Tobias wants to ask a question. Sure, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to ask, regarding the burden of proof, is there like a scale of importance for the burdens that you would have to prove? Like, I know like there might be several questions that you have to ask when you're trying to like prove an argument. What I want to like find out is there like a value of importance on some burdens as opposed to other burdens, or are all of them necessary when you're doing your argument or
Very,
trying to prove
very,
your argument?
very, very good question. So yes, I would say that when you are proving the argument, all of those burdens are necessary to the point where they are contentious. So when what do you think that people are going to contend in the debates? That's what I wanted to talk about, under, preemptive rebuttal. But broadly here, what do you think people are going to contend in the round? So if you do identify, three burdens of proof in your argumentation, you know that some of them require less attention because no one is going to contend them. Like, is anyone really going to contend that, right-wing politicians are more likely to prioritize things like immigration, or sorry, like reducing immigration rather, or more interested in subsidizing things like families, for example, relative to left-wing politicians? So no, really, like not a lot of people would contend this. Like not a lot of people would contend this. So this means that you have to spend less time actually proving this. So you might give, 1, 2 lines of analysis about why they would behave in this way, but you don't need to spend, like how you say it, like a lot of time as you would explaining what sort of policies that they would pass in order to achieve this or how this sort of thing is going to affect. So this means that if people are not going to contend this so much, what they might contend here is why those things are bad. Why is reducing, immigration? Why is it actually a bad thing? Especially if someone can, respond to you by saying, but migrants, make blue collar work exploitative. So yeah, you can identify the burden of proof. Once you have identified them, the next thing that you have to do is think about which ones require me to prove, which ones are going to be contested. What are people going to contest in this debate? What are people going to try and respond to? If people are not going to contest a particular thing, like when you got check this in your head, you don't think that someone really is going to argue that, the churches care about the spiritual, value of their followers. So, for example, let's say with the emotion about this house as a competent politician will try to win by any means necessary. So usually not a lot of people will contend, who a competent politician is. What I tried to do in that debate was say a competent politician might be competent in terms of politics, like competent because they don't like, frauding their way into elections, or might be competent because of the fact that, in a failing democracy, the way that we think of competence is if someone is, really doing a good job, like, in their office. So yeah, this is like what you mean by, no one is going to really contend what a competent politician is. But to a very significant extent, people would contend what trying to win by any means necessary looks like. So that's what you want to spend a lot of your time explaining what trying to win by any means necessary would mean in the specific context of that particular debate. So I don't know if this answers your question, but I'm open to clarifying any further.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so the next thing then is the next slide on preemptive rebuttal. So when we say preemptive rebuttal, this is like when you teach it's at the basic level, you tell people, you know, the other side is going to say this, you know. I think I once learned at some point that, you know, a smart opposition would say this. So like you try to bait your opponent into saying this. All of this are not are general practices on preemptive rebuttal. Usually out of fashion because like if you try and bait someone by saying a smart opposition would say this, what if they don't say this? What if they aren't really smart? Um, Generally as well, you know, if you try and do this, you are wasting your time usually, because you're trying to respond to something that is a trade-off in the debate that is implicit in your case. I'm going to try and talk about this, you know, very soon and give you a very broad example. But what you're trying to do here is that you want to ensure that you are building, you know, the mechanisms or what you anticipate that the other side is going to say into your case. You want to build them into your case. You don't want to go directly and start responding to them, generally because you won't have a lot of time to do this. So an example was I was in a debate where the motion was this House believes that debt trap diplomacy is justified. So that was the motion. This House believes that debt trap diplomacy is justified. So easily, what the other side is going to tell you, I was OG in that round. So what the other side is going to tell you usually is that, you know what, guys, debt trap makes, you know, countries, you know, poor. They have to pay, you know, they have to keep paying on that debt after a long period of time. It means that the countries don't develop, etc., etc., etc. So that was true to some extent. You know, everyone knows that the other side is going to really tell you about Sri Lanka, and you know that the ports got seized, etc. And this is something that you should avoid, and that's why debt diplomacy is not justified. So what we did in that debate was to say that, you know, countries will always try to influence each other in international geopolitics. Like countries would always try to do this, you know. So that was the first thing that we identified because their side wanted to force us into a very bad trade-off. That wasn't the debate. The trade-off wasn't whether or not debt trap diplomacy is independently justified. The trade-off was what are the justifications for debt trap diplomacy in a world where international geopolitics is inevitable? So that was the trade-off in the debate. Like the debate isn't happening, you know, it's not a philosophical debate, like, you know, where we're like evaluating things as, you know, concepts instead of actually practical stuff. So yeah, that was the first thing that we got past. You know, we pushed it burden to them that international geopolitics was inevitable. Countries will always try and influence each other in multiple ways. And what we tried to explain was that this was the best way. Like this was the best way that, you know, you could try and get countries to try and influence each other. So what we said was that there are other ways, you know, like, you know, regime changes that, you know, some countries would fund, like sanctions and like directly invading them. So yeah, intuitively as well, one might anticipate that, you know, people would say diplomacy, but also we try to build this into our mech by saying, you know what, in international geopolitics, like, you know, and when it comes to debt trap diplomacy, you know, diplomacy is not comparative, like it's non-comparative in the debate. So like people can be diplomatic and give you debts, like that's what the motion says, debt trap diplomacy. So diplomacy is a debt trap is a form of diplomacy, you know, that also integrates every aspect of trying to talk to a country. And what we said here was that if on their side was less diplomatic because it either involved trying to change the government, you know, like via Russian interference in elections, or the US trying to change regimes in Libya or Ukraine, or, you know, sanctioning them, you know, trying to force them to do stuff just like the United States tried to do in, you know, with Afghanistan after it left, or with Russia, or, you know, also by trying to invade them, like the United States did in Cuba some years ago. So what we said here was that all of these were what they had to deal with. So we changed the trade-off in the debates from being trying to justify debt trap diplomacy in isolation to saying international geopolitics is inevitable as step one. Then as step two, that the other ways of, you know, doing this stuff were worse. So these are the things that we try to prove. The right mechanisms that we try to prove through this. Like, you know, we try to say that, you know, they didn't allow people to consent on the ground. Like there was no way that no government would consent to, you know, use sanctioning them. or trying to change them or remove them from power or invading their country. Like no one ever consents to this. What we said was that with debt trap, people indirectly consent to this, via their government. People can know what loans your government are taking and vote based on this basis. Like, if someone decides to randomly invade your country or sanction, this is something that your government cannot consent to, which means that you indirectly cannot consent to this in any way or form. So this is like one of the mechanisms that we try to prove, with this. So integrated into our case, the other side hadn't spoken. We are OG, and what we tried to do was to anticipate all that they were going to say was that debt trap diplomacy was bad because it crippled countries and it took their assets from them. But we sort of tried to explain that the countries can't consent to this, as opposed to every other thing on their side. And then finally, also we proved that there was some sort of development that was going to occur as well, given that if you get debt, like the country that you took the debt from still wants you to pay back. Like it's untrue that countries always want to seize your ports. Like not always true. Countries still want you to pay the debt back, so it's going to also lead to some form of employment as well. So what we said here was that this was the only method that saved the most amount of lives and led to the most amount of development in international geopolitics. So yeah, that embodies everything here on the slide in some way. I might give a further example if people have no more question about this stuff. But the best practices here with with the preemptive rebuttal isn't for me to say, what, the other side is going to say that debt trap diplomacy leads to countries losing their resources, etc. No. We built internally into our case that countries don't want to take your resources every time. They don't want to take your port every time. Like, as well as the fact that they want you to pay that money back more than they want to take your port, as well. Or we proved that countries can consent to those ports being taken in the first place, so it isn't really bad. So all of this was our constructive case, but implicitly it had the rebuttal that engaged with the other side and everything else that they wanted to say. Because the comparative that they had to deal with was that this countries was worse. So we pushed a higher burden to them immediately without, having to defeat their case on the ground. So like we just went a step further in the debates, and pushed a higher burden to them without having to rely on what they had to say or what we anticipated that they had to say. So the benefit of doing preemptive rebuttal this way is that this means that you spend your time on what is going to be debated instead of what you just assume, or what you presume that the other side is going to say, which they might say, but may not be important, or which they might say, but might be harder for you to rebut, which means that in that particular debate, you just have to point to the judges what the trade-off is in the round. And that's also something that you can build into your case, as well as the fact that you can also build the response that they have to your case as well, into your case as well. So this is also what a response to the question that Toby asked, which is how do you make preemptive, how do you identify which burdens of proof, what burdens of proof do you have to engage with? Like this is, what is the other side going to respond to? What are they going to engage with? So that's how you identify which burdens you should, focus on and which burdens you shouldn't. Because this comes from, what are they going to contest in my case, or what case are they going to, offer as well? And how do I, try to deal with this in anticipation? So yeah, that's it about preemptive rebuttal, how to do it, and basically what it is all about. If you do have any questions about this, feel free to shoot me a question. All right, so I'm going to move to the next thing, which is like the role of POIs in rebuttal. Okay, so I think that the problem here is that don't be misled by the slide. It's intentional. POIs are not for rebuttal, as most people think. Like, to be honest, POIs and the intention of a POI isn't to rebut a team. Like, if a team has actually spent a good amount of time proving an argument, like 1 minute, 2 minutes proving an argument, how do you think you can rebut it by just, the 15 seconds response? Like, this is if they actually did good response, did good constructive, but if they did bad constructive as well, then 15 seconds on rebuttal isn't actually rebuttal. Like, you're just pointing out that they have missed something, which isn't actually a very strong rebuttal. So you can't do a very strong rebuttal in like 15 minutes and I'm going to destroy the entire case. This means that, you should prioritize, effectively responding to a team in your speeches rather than in the POI. But yeah, what is the role of POI in engagement? Firstly, if you are going to speak after a team, so if you have one more speaker that speaks after a team, then, you want to point out, a strong aspect to their case. Like you want to point out the strongest aspect of their case that they're going to attack, or a premise that they are missing. So you want to point out the premise in their case that they are missing that you want to deal with. This means that you don't want to in your POI point out a refutation to their conclusion. You usually want to point out that they are missing a premise, a key premise in the debate. This is for various reasons. This is one to allow you to see if they actually were missing that premise. Because usually what people fail to understand is that certain teams have provided the premise and they weren't listening, or they fail to understand that, if they point it out, in the rebuttal, someone might just rebuild it. So you want to give the team a fair chance to engage, So you want to point out they're missing a premise. This is the premise that you're missing. And that allows, maybe the speaker that's incoming or the speaker that's coming, that's speaking currently to maybe have some chance to say something about that particular case, and then you have something to respond to. Otherwise, maybe in your speech, if you just point out that they are missing the premise, this might not be very, very effective. If the judge actually believes that case. So pointing out to a team that you're going to speak after that they are missing something in their case allows you to identify if they actually missed that thing or you just didn't listen, or if missing out that thing was damaging to their case or not. So it allows you to prioritize what to rebut. But if you are going to POI a team that is speaking after you, like you're a closing team, and you're an opening, you cannot save your case. You cannot rebut the entire case in 15 seconds. Generally, if you ask the POI to member, whip is going to have time to rebuild it. This doesn't mean that you cannot challenge the premise that they have provided in the debate if it obviously doesn't make sense. But a very strong closing team asking them a POI that tries to destroy their case might be unstrategic. And what you want to do is to try and compare your case to theirs in the POI. Try to explain why your case is still more important than theirs. Trying to respond in isolation isn't always going to be effective unless the team is obviously making a terrible argument. What you wouldn't expect for a good team or a team in your intermediate level may not always make bad arguments as a novice would that will allow you to easily call out that there's some logical inconsistency in your case. So what you want to prioritize here is trying to compare your case that you have proven to theirs. So this allows the judges to remember what you've said. Also allows the judges to think about what they are saying in comparison to what you have said. Not just the freshness of closing teams usually makes judges forget about what you have said in opening. So this means conclusively that POIs are good at pointing out why teams are bad when they are obviously bad, but not good at dealing with teams that are thoroughly good. So yeah, that is the role of POIs when it comes to rebuttal and engagement. Generally wouldn't recommend that you use it to try and destroy a team that has spent 2 minutes explaining an argument in POI. So for example, I think that this was the semis of a tournament I attended. So I spent some time trying to explain why democracy is a good thing. This was a motion about welcoming the alliance of the Sahel states. If you're not heard about it, it's there's a couple of states that are mostly military governments, governments that took over from a democratically elected government. So what we tried to say in that debate was to say that we do not welcome, we oppose the alliance of the Sahel states. So yeah, I spent a lot of time trying to explain, why why this is undemocratic, bad, and democracy is a good thing. So I get a POI from closing that says, is a benevolent dictatorship worse than a what do people call it this day? Than a failing democracy or dysfunctional democracy. So that's what the POI from closing was. So that's essentially what you can do in a POI. So I think that the POI was trying to ask me if I had proven that the dictatorship is benevolent. So that was what I thought the POI was about, because essentially I had, at that point, I was in my 3rd minute and I was still talking about the point about democracy. So I spent a lot of time on that argument, either by trying to prove that, the nature of the Sahel Alliance is going to lead to these governments being more repressive because they lack internal legitimacy and external legitimacy, or the fact that democracy is valuable in African states because of the fact that, we're heterogeneous in a culture. So it means that people require representation in order for them to believe in the government. So yeah, there are a lot of things in addition to this that we try to prove. So when the POI comes in and it's like, you prefer a benevolent dictatorship to, a dysfunctional democracy, I can understand what a POI is about. It's trying to challenge if the mechanisms in the case are present. So, but it will be unstrategic for a team to say, in response, I don't think that was the best use of the POI from CEO anyways. But I think that it would be very hard for them in 15 seconds to challenge, everything I said about the nature of the Sahel Alliance, and that it's going to be more repressive because they are echo chambers and dictators that you have amongst themselves. So they are going to increase and be repressive. There's no incentive for them to transition back to a democracy because their legitimacy is fringe. They do care about if they do continue being repressive, that means that they are going to want to hold on to power more. So they don't get tried when they allow for a transition, etc. So yes, that's essentially what the POI can be about. The POI can never, be successful at taking down everything I said unless there's an obvious logical error that I made. Yeah. Are there any questions about this before we move on? Okay, no questions. Next slide. So yes, the next slide. Oh, I think that we have gotten to the final slide. The final slide is about practical tips. So yeah, everything I've said so far are I've given you 20 ways that you can think about rebuttal. So this means that if a team makes one argument, that you can comfortably think about 20 responses to their argument. But usually a lot of people would say, how do I do this? Like in a debate room where you are thinking about stuff, thinking about your own case, listening to the other side and trying to come up with responses. How do I do this? So I usually tell people that debating isn't a skill that you acquire at once. The skill of learning how to analyze arguments or learning how to respond to argument isn't developed at a go. You don't get to develop it immediately. You get to develop it via thinking, and training your brain to do certain things automatically. So when we think about all of this case, this means that when we're talking about all of this, that means that when you go to your next spar and you want to improve on rebuttal, when you hear a team make an argument, what you want to do in the less amount of time that you have is to try and come up with as much responses to that argument using each of these heuristics that I provided. You might have your own additional heuristics, but using these methods that I provided, you can think about maybe 15 ways to respond to them as quickly as possible. So that's the goal. There's not going to be me trying to provide you a response for every argument in the debate meta, because people would make those arguments differently. And if people made that argument the way they are in the meta, then you cannot refute the argument if the arguments are made very well. Obviously, no one can make a perfect argument in 40 minutes. So this means that, learning about these heuristics and thinking about what they are missing, based on what we have discussed so far, and practicing them is the only way to improve. So when your brain, learns this stuff, then it means that they are able to easily adapt within the context of the debate room. There are practical steps that you could use to go about this. One is by, listen to a debate, listen to a speech, pause the speech, and, try to come up with as much responses in the littlest amount of time possible. Listen to a speech, pick one argument from the speech, or pick 3 arguments, go to the first one, maybe give yourself 10 minutes, come up with 20 responses, give yourself 5 minutes for the second argument, come up with 20 responses. So all of these are like brain exercises. They're like trying to train your brain the way your brain needs to adapt to in a debate room, because that's where you need to test the skill. In a debate room, you have less time, maybe write down the point and come up with as much responses as possible. But given that debating is a brain activity, and the fact that if you are at an intermediate level where when you see emotion, you obviously know the arguments that people are going to run, isn't just a function of the fact that you are very good at, coming up with arguments, but because of the fact that your brain is used to, thinking about stuff in that way. And this also applies to responses. The only way that you can improve is to mentally strain your brain to always think about this stuff when people are making those arguments. So usually it's not about admiring the quality of the speaker or, the fine language they're using or the 5 mechanisms that they're providing. But if you have trained your brain to think about those mechanisms in terms of, wait, is this person really repeating stuff that is going to happen on either side? Yeah, I agree with the mechanism, but really is the outcome bad? So like when you are asking yourself those questions immediately, then you're able to come up with answers. That means that you have as much responses, like 5 responses. So yeah, even if the premise is correct, the conclusion isn't a bad conclusion. Even if the conclusion was bad, it isn't that bad. Even if it's bad, there's a different way for us to mitigate this outcome, or there's a different way for us to achieve this good impact that they care about as well. Even if it's bad, it doesn't affect as much people. So yeah, there is a way that you train your brain, and you have 5, 6 response. Immediately a person makes an argument because you are thinking about how to respond to that argument in multiple ways, and your brain is already used to that particular activity. So it isn't hard for you to do this within the debate room. So the practical way to do this is always to, maybe in a week, 1 week, find 1 day in a week, listen to a speech, 7 minutes, very good speech, write down maybe 2 arguments that the person tries to prove in the speech. Give yourself time, maybe 20 minutes for argument 1, and try to come up with maybe 20 responses, reduce the time, go to argument 2, try to come up with as much responses as well for argument 2. Just keep reducing the time and write down as much responses that you're able to come up with. By the time you are done, you would see that your brain is familiar to this sort of activity. That means that you can do less time and come up with the same amount of responses because your brain is forced to adopt the shortcut. So it's like the recent your browsing history. So that's what your brain looks like at this point. Yeah. The other tool or tip is listening, which people underestimate in debating. So the only time I encourage you to talk to your partner is when people have stopped speaking, or when your team isn't going to speak again and you're deciding what POI to ask. Even this is even bad. It's really bad because the problem here is that when you don't listen, then you miss out on stuff that people are saying. Either you miss out on a premise that they have provided, and you come to respond, and then you're responding to something that they have already accounted for, or you don't listen and you're distracted by the fact that they said monopolies, and you already assume that they have proven the point. This means that you have to respond to the best version of the monopoly arguments that the team never made. So this means that you have to listen to exactly what they're saying and specific mechanisms that they're provided. So what have they said to prove this point? Maybe they've talked about monopolies, but they haven't really proven it. But if you don't listen and you just heard monopoly because it's your brain actually reacts more to that word when it's being said, because your brain is familiar to that word being said in multiple debates, then this means that you have to start responding to the best version of an argument that wasn't made in the room. So that's why listening is important. It helps you track what arguments have been fully completed, what arguments haven't been fully completed, what arguments are vulnerable, what arguments are not. So when you don't do this, when you don't listen, then you end up either not responding to an argument or struggling to respond to an argument that you cannot respond to, that the team never made in that room. So that means that, for example, if I wasn't listening, then I wouldn't be able to find out that, CG had no conclusion about the extension about, access. They just said access, but they never really explained why, what access is. What do you mean when you say access? They just said access, which it's hard to respond to when people say things become more accessible. Everyone just agrees that accessibility is a good thing, but accessibility to what? What do you mean by access? So yeah, that is, I guess, all about the practical stuff. If people have more general questions about everything I've been discussing so far, then you can ask. But I do believe that we have come to the end of the lesson today. Any questions? So
Hello,
yes, no?
Sam. I think a lot of people had to run off for dinner because it's getting a bit late. But I
Yeah.
think the first question that I would probably have is that when you fail with your rebuttal strategies, what do you do then? Because if you need to recalibrate and all, what would you suggest or recommend other people doing to just to recalibrate themselves and get things on order in their case?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the first part of the question.
Right. So, for example, at times you ask the wrong POI and maybe you take the wrong strategy with your POI. What do you do afterwards to recover? That was my question for you.
Oh, okay, yeah. So when you ask the wrong POR and then you realize that, it's him, like you made a mistake, like you missed out on something that they've already said, then the best way to adapt there is to think about, is it really worth responding to? So like they've properly proven this point. So should I go the route of trying to refute the premise that they have provided, or should I go the route of trying to refute their impact? Is that going to be, what the judges would believe, or what they, is that going to be easier for me to do? Because sometimes, if it is the case that they have the correct premise in the debate, then that means that it's going to be difficult for you to, come back and, respond to it as well. Additionally, it might be the case that that's not the argument that you should be responding to as well. So it may not be the argument that you should be responding to, maybe a different argument that they have made. And also a different strategy that you can always use is to recalibrate, like to reemphasize the argument that they have made that they may not consider to be the most important one, but it's going to be the easiest one for you to respond to, but for you to recalibrate the strongest, portions of their case. This doesn't mean, misconstruing their case. Like obviously, if a team thought that argument one was the most important argument in the debates, like the principal argument that they made was the most important thing, that you should try and respond to it as best as possible, rather than trying to, maybe raise to a greater proportion, the second argument that they make. But this might be something that is valuable for you as CG if you're not OG, to try and, maybe recalibrate, or sorry, to raise the proportion of the argument that they've made. But if you ask a POI and you realize that your POI that you asked means that you missed something, at that point, what you might want to change in terms of the strategy might not be to, respond to the premise, because usually impacts are disputable. They are easily contestable. Even if a team proves an impact, it's contestable if that impact is good. It's easy for you to persuade the judges that it isn't good, it isn't going to occur to the extent that they claim. Beyond it might be harder to disprove a premise, usually because like some people just rely on intuition as a shortcut, which might be something that judges might buy into a lot. I don't know if that responds to the question.
Oh, that responds to the question perfectly. I will. Thank you so much. Sam, so I think if there are no other questions, we'll move on to wrapping up.
Yeah, Toby has one. I think Toby raised the hand.
Okay, I also have a question.
No, I think you have.
Okay. Bronny, you raised the hand. Oh, sorry, you're
Yeah,
muted. But you're soft.
yes, Sam, please, I have a question. And so
Sure.
I just wanted to know, like from experience, um, what do you think is actually best within a talk room? Should you go for a refutation or you should go for a rebuttal within a talk room? Because what I have realized is that when you are in a talk room and somebody, let's say, rebuts the opponent's case, and you come in to do a refutation of the case that came from the opposition team, they still, or judges still say that the case was already like mitigated. And so, from your experience, I want to know what works. And given that you have been very successful within the African space in of itself, I just want to know what really works within the African space in of itself. And is it refutation that works the most, or rebuttal that works the most? Yeah.
Fair enough. Usually I think it's just like bad judging practice. Like, so I'm going to answer the question later on, but like I think it's bad judging practice, to consider like the fact that someone has responded to a case, then that any further response to the case is unnecessary. Because like as long as it is the case that you're not responding to that case in the same way that your opening has responded to it, like given that we have discussed like about 20 ways that you could respond, if your opening just use like maybe 2 or 3 and you have an extra one that you think your opening didn't use, the judges should credit this. But yeah, like you said, that the question is relevant to a top room, where you want to try and win. So yeah, usually the goal is to like avoid a fourth. If you're like closing in a top room, you know that your opening has responded to this argument, which is like where this scenario would vastly apply. I think that it would be difficult for your closing to respond to an argument in a POI that you cannot anticipate from opening. And if they respond to the argument, then there's no way that you can do this in the POI as well. So I think that the question that you're asking then is valuable if you are in top room and opening, you have a very strong opening that is clearly beating up bench, and you want to try and see how you can, survive in the room. So usually the goal is like not to win, because like if you have a strong opening, then presumably like you lose them. But if you want to try and beat the up teams in the debate, what you want to try and do is maybe extend on something that hasn't been said so far in the debate. Additionally, is also to try and frame your response not as a response, but as a constructive argument. So this means that, for example, maybe opening has responded to the case about the church, and the fact that transhumanism is going to make people leave the church, and then you're like your opening is going to be like transhumanism will make people leave because like people would like to stay in religion because of like the comfort that it offers, the social benefits, etc. That's the religious benefit, but that it consoles people when they have a bad day, etc. So people wouldn't leave the church if the church decided to support transhumanism, and that response is sufficient. So the way that you want to try and enter the debate might not be to go about that particular point. It might just be to respond to the premise because the premise that they might be relying on in the debates is that the church cares only about the spiritual stuff like of its followers. The church only cares about its followers. It might not be that the church also cares about staying relevant in politics, to prevent to restrict or go up against people like that want to tax churches more, that want to tax churches in the first place, or want to ban religious institutions from indoctrinating people. So that's why church cares specifically about politics. Also, they might care about politics, in terms of being able to attract, donations. Like people don't audit church finances as much, etc. So if it is the case that the church cares about other things, and this is a rebuttal, you could always phrase this as, people would remain in the church, but the church has other priorities, and that's why OG's case doesn't work. But OO has already provided some response that OG's case doesn't work because the church or people wouldn't leave the church. And what you're trying to respond to is like to respond to their premise that relies on the fact that this is the only thing that the church cares about. But you don't want to phrase this as a response. What you want to do when you want to phrase this as a new case, like a constructive argument, that you want to prove, which is to say that the church wants to remain politically relevant. So this means that you can beat both CG and OG by explaining that OG's response rather proves that the people don't leave the church. True, but that's like smaller impact. Like in their cases, explaining why people don't leave the church, or like why the church, this is just beneficial for spirituality because that means that the church is able to emphasize this doctrine via a message of God has eliminated our original sin and we are not going to die anymore. So yeah, they might be winning on the level of spiritual validation that the church is able to provide to transhumanism, but you're just explaining that you're going to discuss an impact on politics which outframes top half because of the fact that OO's case that OG responds to might rely on thinking that the church cares about spiritual health only, which you are going to go beyond in your extension. So it means that you don't have to phrase your extension as a direct response to OO, so that you avoid this judge's trap as well. But in case that you don't have anything at all, so you don't have, maybe your opening already has covered this ground as well, you might go the response route and try to point out why your responses are unique in beating opening up, or opening government rather. maybe you may not beat your opening, but you are successful or guaranteed to take a third or a fourth, or a second, which might be very valuable as well in the top room, so you don't, tank entirely. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah, great. It does. Thank you.
Amazing. Okay, so I think that there was one last thing I wanted to talk about, but that I think I forgot to mention, which is like, using principal arguments. And usually it is the case that, the only way to refute a principal argument, usually a principal argument is an ethical argument made to appeal to what people value. And if a team makes a good principal argument, maybe you might try to say that the practical stuff outweighs the principle, but usually this is not a good response, in my opinion, because I think that principle argument are principle. Like, if someone values something and thinks that that value is objectively something that we should do or that we ought to do, then it means that it's not reducible to say that, we ought to do something else. So that means that, the practical argument only works if the judge never believed the principal argument anyway. So if someone is able to prove as well that the principle is something that we ought to do irrespective of any consequence, then the only thing that you can do to refute the principal argument is to try and explain why it is not equivalent. So usually when people make the argument about governments, doing something, maybe reparations, for example, the only way you can do reparation is if reparations coming from someone who stole, like, if someone did steal something and you say that they should offer reparation, so it's not really inconsistent. Like, the principle of reparation, not the practical benefit of reparation, is contingent on, the fact that someone stole something and they have to pay back for it. So this usually is like a debate where like someone just goes on about, the rich should give, maybe a debate about, rich people, subsidizing healthcare for the poor. Someone might just go on, the rich should do this because they have, they have stolen from the poor. But how have they stolen from the poor? That might be innocent. So they have to explain how they have stolen from the poor. If they don't, then they're just making an assertion at the top about how the rich acquire their wealth. It means that they haven't fully proven the argument, the principle. And if it's a principle, this is where the argument is more vulnerable, because if the argument was practical as well, then the intuition might be very effective, but you might just call it out, given that the principle has to rely on direct action, or the principle is only valuable if it's like the correct action to do. If it's any portion of the argument of the principle is missing, then you cannot rely on the intuition of the argument. Like, also, the rights that people have are contingent on, duties that are imposed on others as well. So this means that, if it is the case that you're able to prove that this right that someone has doesn't, place a duty on another person to respect that right, so if you are able to prove that there are instances where we can violate this right, and that this instance is, equivalent. So it is an instance where we can violate that right, when someone makes an argument about free speech and tells you that free speech is the most important argument in debate, well, obviously we do violate it in certain instance. Secondly, maybe a duty to have free speech isn't contingent on, doesn't place a duty on other individuals to provide this sort of thing to you as well. Just as, the way my right to life is maybe contingent on other people's ability not to kill, or other people's duty not to kill me. Maybe free speech is contingent on some other actor to guarantee your free speech as opposed to others as well. Given that, people cannot compel you to speak, then also that you cannot compel others to guarantee you a freedom to speak in the way that, as long as they don't, restrict, like maybe people taking resources from you, or might prevent your ability to live. So like your rights are clashing directly with them. But, free speech might not be as competing as right to life. Then this might be something that you might explain that, the duties that people are explaining in this instant are not equivalent, or that the rights that they are explaining that is being taken away from them is a right that we can't take away from them because that right is an absolute, or that the action that they have explained that is principally consistent isn't consistent because of the actor that they have described doesn't have any responsibility for that thing that they are describing. So like the poor should pay for, subsidies for the healthcare of the rich should pay subsidies of healthcare for the poor, why do they have this responsibility in the first place? Even if they have this responsibility, why do they have to fulfill this responsibility in this unique way? So these are the ways that you sort of deal with principled arguments. It's not to rebut the idea in the principle, because if everyone agrees that stealing is wrong, then you are losing by trying to explain that, um, stealing is good. So like stealing might be good in this case. So like the Robin Hood example, like if someone agrees that stealing is bad, then they might disagree with the Robin Hood example. So your best shot at a principle might be to explain that, this isn't stealing. So if someone says that reparation is good, you might just say that, maybe reparation isn't good because like, you just disagree with the ethics of, reparation and Robin Hood, for example. But this is not a good response. If someone agrees that reparation is justified ethically, it might be to explain that there isn't reparation happening because there are certain conditions that are required for reparations to happen. So bad ways of responding to principled argument is by trying to compare them to a practical stuff, because if someone believes the practical stuff, then that means that the principle is losing anyways. Another bad way is to try and refute the intuition, because if someone agrees with that intuition, if someone agrees that that thing is morally right to do, then you can't convince them otherwise. If someone agrees that stealing is wrong, then instead of trying to convince them that stealing is good, which will be unsuccessful at doing, it's better to convince them this isn't stealing or this isn't reparation. That's the best way to refute the principal argument, as well as, trying to explain that, people don't have this responsibility. This is a situation where, we agree that this principle can be suspended, as well as the fact that this principle doesn't require people to behave in this other way that maybe the other team is trying to explain. Yeah, that might be the final thoughts, final stuff about rebuttal. Yeah, I think with that, if people have no further question, it's been a lovely 2 hours. I've enjoyed myself. Also, additionally, rebuttal, refutation, responses, engagement, I think they all coincide with what we have discussed so far. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the WA. We'll always be in touch to answer those questions as well. Thank you very much, Kaushik, for this, very, very helpful session to the community. I think that the debating community needs a lot more of these initiatives as well, and I'm very, very happy that that you are providing a platform for people to interact and have access to this sort of knowledge. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm very, very privileged and happy to be here.
So you took my spotlight, Sam. I was just about to go ahead and thank you. But thank you so much. I think it's people like you who are contributing so much time and effort behind this initiative that is going to help a lot of people eventually. We do understand that sometimes it's not the best time to have these sessions. So we do have recordings going up and people do get the chance to view these on YouTube later on as well. Again, a very huge thank you, Sam, for agreeing to come on board with us and what was a very insightful and detailed sessions. I'm sure a lot of people got a lot of information from this and they also took away a lot of new things which they would not have had a chance to analyze. Um, as you can see, a lot of people in the chat are also thanking you. I'll just stop the recording now and the screen share. In case there are no other questions, we can soon wrap up. Again, once again, thank you to all the participants also who took away time to come here and then participate in this. We also have other workshops scheduled pretty soon. You can check them out through our calendars and join us for that. Sam is also doing one more, so you can very definitely join that as well on the 12th. If I'm not wrong. And again, Sam, thank you so much for coming on board with us. And we can wrap up now if there are no more questions.
Yep. Thank you very much.